Now, this is a little timeline of the covenants in the Bible. We're just going to briefly mention Abraham, Moses, and David here. These are the covenants made with the Israelites. Back in the Old Testament, God made a covenant with Abraham called the Abrahamic Covenant. And in that covenant, he gave a people. There would be a people that would come from Abraham. They would be God's people, the descendants of Abraham. And not just that, they would live in a land. The Abrahamic covenant gave a people and a land. The covenant then with Moses, when he received the Ten Commandments and the law, was how that people ought to live in that land. How should they live? Well, by following God's laws, the giving of the law with Moses. Then the covenant with David is a king to rule over that people and that land as they seek to obey God's laws. They're connected together, those three. The covenant with David established a king to rule over the people well. You see, before there was a king, some of the tribes obeyed God, some of the tribes didn't obey God. In Judges, we read that everybody did whatever they wanted because there was no king. There was no central leadership, no cohesion. And so the covenant with David established a leader, a representative of the people who would or ought to exemplify what it meant to live in obedience to God, who would represent the people, be a sort of figurehead. And you can see that in verse 13. I will be his father, he will be my son. The king would be a son of God. Now, back in the ancient world, some of the ancient people believed their kings were divine. The Israelites didn't believe that. They knew that their king was just an ordinary fellow Israelite. In fact, all of God's people were sons and daughters of God. God calls the whole nation my son, my firstborn son. And yet the king was God's son in a special way, sort of in an adopted way, in a special way, representing the people before God. A figurehead, a federal head, you might say in theological terms, leading them under God. And the covenant with David establishes this person, this king. In future weeks, we'll see when the king is good and loves the Lord, things are very good for God's people. But when the king is not good and doesn't love the Lord, things are very bad for God's people. Because the king was to represent them before God. Now, in some ways, this covenant with David here in this chapter is the high point of the Old Testament. Perhaps the very high point is Solomon as he builds the temple. But this is what it was all pointing forward to in the Old Testament. As God called a people, as he rescued a people with Abraham, Moses, the Exodus. All of these things, Joshua, as they start to live in the land, were finding their culmination in the covenant with David, the Davidic covenant, where God gave them a king to rule them. This covenant, in other words, has a huge part to play in the Old Testament.